est probablement les critiques d'architecture les plus importantes de Grande-Bretagne en ce moment, et peut-être même ailleurs que Grande-Bretagne. Et Rowan, il a une formation d'architecte, donc il est architecte d'abord, il a étudié à Cambridge, ensuite il a travaillé comme architecte, donc il avait son agence en partenariat avec un associé, mais il est passé assez rapidement au journalisme, en inventant aussi un nouveau type de critique d'architecture pour les journaux nationaux. Donc il a travaillé très longtemps au London Evening Standard, il a été éditeur à Blueprint, et après pendant 6 ans, le directeur de l'Architecture Foundation, c'est la fondation de l'architecture à Londres. Il est maintenant critique d'architecture du Observer. Il a écrit un livre qui s'appelle Why We Build, à partir duquel cette présentation inspiration, paru dans Picador cette année, là, en septembre. Donc c'est une nouveauté. Rowan, il écrit pas seulement d'architecture, mais participe activement vraiment dans les choix d'architectes, surtout dans le cadre des grands concours de haut profil, et il conseille aussi des promoteurs, des livres, des administrations sur les choix d'architectes. C'est quelqu'un qui est vraiment un très vivé, il a été en conversation avec les plus grands architectes au monde, qui connaît très bien, qui a pratiqué la critique d'architecture contemporaine depuis des dizaines d'années, donc il s'y connaît très bien. Et les thèmes de ce livre, mais il saura mieux les présenter que moi, est ce qui est invisible dans l'architecture, tout ce qui sont les substances plus subtiles, plus invisibles, qui ne sont pas du niveau de la construction d'éléments constructifs, donc les désirs, les émotions, les luttes de pouvoir, des égos, etc., ont une influence dans les visibles dans l'architecture. Donc c'est ces relations-là qui l'intéressent. Et évidemment, la présentation sera sur une partie seulement des thèmes qui sont analysés dans ces livres, que je vous invite tous à lire.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. And for those of you who I saw in London, it's nice to see you again, and thank you for waiting. So what I'm going to talk about is the relationship of architecture to truth and appearance, and also to sort of disguise and deception, if you like. As Alessandra said, I've just written a book, Why We Build. There's a chapter in that called Truth, or About Truth. But in fact, it's something that keeps popping up during the other parts of the book, because it is actually a kind of fundamental part of architecture, which is that buildings are both instruments and symbols, to put it very simply. They do a job, and they look as if they're doing a job, or they purport to be doing a job. And these two roles can be more or less coincident with each other. In other words, a building can look as if it's doing something and actually be doing something, or it can look as if it's doing something and actually achieve the opposite. An example might be a housing block built by a municipality, which might appear to be addressing the issues of housing shortage or living conditions of the poor. And that building might really be doing that, or it might only look as if it is because maybe it doesn't actually solve the problems in the way in which would be most helpful. Maybe it solves the problems for some people but creates problems for other people. Maybe, as happens quite often, one set of dwellings is cleared in order to build kind of better quality dwellings, but actually that creates a problem for the people who lived in the dwellings that they're in the first place. So, that's a kind of simple example of how buildings are not necessarily doing what they seem to be doing. But because they're very big, powerful, difficult, expensive things, they're particularly effective ways of symbolizing action, and politicians love that in architecture, and because they're so visible. There's another example at a different scale that I give in my book, which was the British architect Cedric Price. Used to tell a story about how he was invited by a couple to design a new kitchen or something for their house, and he went round, and the husband and the wife told him what their different ideas were for the new improved house he was going to make for them. And at the end of the evening he said, "You don't need a new kitchen, you need a divorce," because what was happening is that this couple were kind of projecting onto the building their hopes for a better home and for a better family life, which was actually not so fantastic. And Cedric Price worked out that's what was going on, that they were actually trying to make their house into a kind of symbol of a kind of harmony that wasn't there. And so he gave them this rather brutal and practical advice. And I'm not really setting out to moralize. I'm not saying that, and importantly, I'm not saying that complete honesty, complete transparency, truthfulness is either desirable or possible in architecture. What I want to do most of all is to point out, sort of make you aware of this as a question, or a very important part of architecture, and maybe suggest some ways in which it can be kind of negotiated, dealt with, responded to by architects, and indeed by everybody else who's concerned with buildings. Okay, I'm going to start with a very simple way in which buildings lie, if you like. This is architecture as propaganda. The project I'm showing is something called the All Union Agricultural Exhibition, which is on the outskirts of Moscow. It's sort of like a bit like a world fair, except it was purely done by the Soviet government for the Soviet people, in theory. It's a vast park, a vast piece of land with a series of pavilions in it. And it was first conceived in the 1930s under Stalin's government, with the intention that it would be open in 1937, which was the 20th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And its purpose was to celebrate two things in particular. One was the incredible productiveness of Soviet agriculture. And here you have a fountain which, as you'll see, is made up of all sorts of kind of fruit and vegetables and flowers, and it's an image of incredible fecundity and the richness of the earth that Mother Russia has, such that this kind of wonderful amount of food and nourishment can come from it. It also celebrates the friendship of the republics of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of different republics, some of which are now independent countries, such as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, etc., Siberia. And the message that Stalin wanted to communicate by building this park was that these republics were all equals, and they all existed in kind of happy fraternity or sorority. And this is a fountain that celebrates that fact. So these golden figures represent the different republics of the Soviet Union. Now, this was in fact a time when there were huge famines in Russia. Millions and millions of people were dying of hunger. So therefore, to celebrate abundance of the land was a somewhat perverse thing to do. And also, there was a far from equal relationship between the republics. Kazakhstan, for example, was very severely brutalized by the Russian government in a number of quite hideous ways. So in other words, this great big architectural enterprise is a big deceit. It's propaganda in 3 dimensions. The buildings I'm actually showing were in fact built in the 50s because the deadline of 1937 was not met. Something was built by about 38, 39, but Stalin didn't like it very much because it wasn't sort of spectacular enough. So after the Second World War, when there were in fact more famines in the late 1940s, he resumed the project. So undeterred by the continuing failure of Soviet agriculture, he still wanted to glorify it. It's also, of course, a glorification of his regime, and it was completed quite shortly before he died, so it's actually celebrating something which would shortly end and then be kind of reversed by the successive government of President Khrushchev. But there is some kind of truth to be found there. They're not sort of as intended. This is the Ukrainian pavilion, which is one of the most, or in fact the most magnificent of the. There were a series of pavilions for different republics, as well as a series of pavilions for different branches of agriculture. And this is the one for the state of the Republic of Ukraine, which is particularly magnificent. Why is that? Because Khrushchev, who would become the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin, was from the Ukraine. So he made sure that the pavilion from his part of the Soviet Union was the most splendid one, which was all part of his power play, his asserting his importance relative to his rivals for the succession of Stalin. So if you know how to look at this place, it's a document of the power politics of its time. It reveals something, but that, of course, is not the official intention. Okay, here's another example. Munich, early 18th century. 2 brothers, the Azam brothers, who were Baroque architects, but also sculptors, plaster workers, painters. They did the whole package of what was needed to create religious architecture at that time. And towards the end of their lives, they decided to build a church themselves, which would, with their own money or with their own fundraising, which was almost private. I mean, the public was allowed in, but really it was they wanted to make something that was very personal to themselves. And one of them they built a church, and they built this sort of apartment building at the same time, the next door, church, residence, and one of them lived in the residence, in fact had a little window from his home into the church. And these people were very devout Catholics. It was a time when Catholicism obviously had already for some time been challenged by Protestantism, but also a time when the beginnings of the Enlightenment were also threatening kind of traditional religion. And this can be seen as a very strong assertion of what they believed in. They could not have been more devout. They could not have been more convinced that they were showing what they were showing was true. But the means they use are, if you like, a kind of deceptive or theatrical. So, as you can see, it's a very sort of magnificent, extraordinary thing. It uses an incredible amount of different materials, techniques, skills. So here you are inside, and as churches really always were since the Middle Ages and before that, it's conceived as an image of heaven. And in the ceiling you have an illusionistic painting which shows the church is dedicated to a saint called St. John Nepomuk, who was martyred in Prague in what is now the Czech Republic. And here's the scene of his martyrdom here. And then something like up here, he is being taken up into heaven. And this is all, of course, an illusionary ceiling with false perspective, such that if you stand in one position in the church and you look up, it looks as if you're looking up into a kind of space that isn't really there. If you stand anywhere else except this one point in the church, the perspective is slightly skewed, so it kind of gives the game away that the illusion is not perfect. At the same time, you have combinations of real marble and plaster or wood painted to look like marble. You have solid metal, you have gold leaf, you have silver leaf. In other words, you can say in a way these materials are deceptive. They're not what they really are. They look as like something which they are not. And that's really part of the effect of the space, that there is this kind of incredible fusion of what you imagine, what you perceive, and what's real and what's not real. And it is very, very theatrical, if you like. It's very much like going into a theatre and seeing a performance, and being sort of drawn into it and persuaded by it. And of course, it's not just the architecture, it's also the ritual, the church services, the music, the incense, the candlelight. It's a kind of multi-sensory experience. And at the same time, there's this extraordinary detail, which is this kind of rockery here, which is an actual bit of rock. It's not fake. But because so much else is fake, if you like, it's sort of pretend stuff, and because it's so kind of incongruous to have this piece of rock in the street, you kind of begin to doubt the reality of the rock. So your understanding of what is real and what is not is thoroughly kind of turned upside down and blurred. So as I say, there's no doubting that the absolute conviction and seriousness of the Arzen brothers about what they wanted to communicate, but they felt the best way to communicate it was through illusion. So if you call that a kind of theatrical attitude to architecture, a theatrical attitude to representing some kind of reality, there's also been an almost opposite view that over the last 200 years in architecture, which is you should never pretend to anything, that what you see in a building is exactly what it is, that you should never disguise a material as anything else. You should never have something that looks like a column, that looks like it's holding up a building when it's not. You should never disguise what's going on inside the building. And John Ruskin, British writer, artist, theorist of the mid-19th century, was a kind of early and very important proponent of this idea. So, as you see, he says, exactly as a woman of feeling would not wear false jewels, so would a builder of honour disdain false ornaments. Using them is just a downright and inexcusable lie. You use that which pretends to a worth which it has not, which pretends to have cost and to be what it did not. Sorry, I'm getting to his language is defeating me here. It is an imposition, a vulgarity, an impertinence, and a sin. Down with it to the ground, grind it to powder, leave its ragged place upon the wall. Rather, you have not paid for it, you have no business with it, you did not want it. So it's a very emotional subject for him. And he elaborated this view of truthfulness, where he said that any form of making a building look like something else than what it is, such as, for example, carving stone so that it looks like drapery, so that it looks like cloth, is totally and utterly wrong. And it's a long story, but the very brief version is this led to a very similar attitude in 20th century architecture, in early modernist architecture, exemplified by something like the Bauhaus, where, again, you don't hide anything. A new idea came in, which was not Ruskin's idea, which was that as well as revealing exactly what the building is made of and how it's built, you also have to show the time in which it is built. You have to use the materials of its own time. In other words, if you live in an industrial age, if you live in an age when things made by machines are kind of what is most typical of the time, then that's what you have to use. You have to use industrial materials. It's kind of dishonest not to. So the Bauhaus, it's a concrete frame building with a steel and glass wall, all totally revealed. Because the wall's glass, you can see what's going on inside. There is, in theory, no pretense, no deception. Le Corbusier, also in the same decade, the 1920s, was following approximately similar ideas, and this is the Villa Savoye outside Paris. So in theory, this is doing the same thing of revealing the fact that it's a concrete building, using the techniques of his own time rather than some sort of historical style, etc. Except it's not completely honest, firstly because it's not actually all made of concrete. A lot of it is made of basically bricks covered in render and painted so that it looks like concrete, so that's already a sort of a bit of a fraud. But also Le Corbusier was very conscious of image of his buildings. This picture shows a couple of pages from the series of books he published of his own work called The Œuvre Complète, and he very carefully controlled the way his buildings were photographed, the way they were published, to present a certain idea or a certain set of ideas about what he was doing. So that's a form of fiction, if you like. It's not just pure, honest building. I'm kind of somewhat violently racing through history here, but this is not really a history lecture, but an attempt to communicate some ideas. And then to take a local example, in the 1970s, the Centre Pompidou by Richard Rogers and Lorenzo Piano. This building, as you know, great cultural palace, had a few important ideas about it. One of it was that it should be very, very flexible, that it should be possible to take things off it, add things to it, change it around at will, rather than being a kind of fixed temple of art, rather than being like a sort of traditional stone building that would be built and would never change. The idea here was that it could be kind of responsive to whatever might happen in the future, that it could be in kind of permanent flux. And so it uses this kind of language of things bolted together, things hanging off the building that you could take off, move around, put them on again in a different way. It also, of course, has all its pipes on the outside so as to create completely open spaces inside. But this is it's not quite what it seems. There's a bit of theatre here. Because, in fact, in its history of now, 35 years, it hasn't, in fact, proved particularly easy to take things off and put them on again. When it was kind of quite expensively refurbished, it was done in a very conventional way. This kind of a supposed ability to take it apart and put it together again wasn't actually used. So there's a kind of architectural language used here that is communicating a message, but it's more symbolic than real. I mean, it is in some ways flexible on the inside because the open spaces inside do make it flexible, but this idea you can take it apart and put it together again is a kind of bit of theatricality. Because it's in the modernist tradition, because it's in this tradition that sort of goes back to Ruskin, it feels obliged to display what it's made of. So it does not use any of the techniques of the Arzen brothers. You can see the structure, you can see the pipes. So that's a kind of modernist idea of truthfulness, but then at the same time it is theatrical. The other way in which it's not quite what it seems is that it was commissioned by President Georges Pompidou, who was a conservative president of France. He took up office immediately following the events of 1968, the student protests, the sort of quasi-revolution, and Georges Pompidou's aim and mandate, if you like, was to restore order, was to kind of pull back from this sort of dangerous moment of 1968 to make France more conservative again. But at the same time, he commissioned this building, which is architecturally, or was architecturally radical, which was quite a shocking presence in the streets of Paris, which a lot of